time I've walked into a barracks building, which granted is not very often, I'm immediately transported back to freshman year in the college dorms. The individual barracks rooms are a good deal larger than my college dorm, and they aren't generally packing 3 grown adults into a space originally sized for 2 Olympic athletes spending a summer in Los Angeles. But there's a lot of growing up that happens in both spaces for a very similarly aged group. It can be so joyful and so festive in that atmosphere, and I often think about how simple and easy it was to just leave the deadbolt out on your door so your friends could come and go while you got ready to attend an event together. There was no transit time, no concerns about somebody riding solo in a sketchy cab. Your friends were there. But for Shannon Wilkerson, life in the barracks made everyone a little too available. He could flit from a party in one room to his wife's room down the hall, then over to an affair partner's room next door. And in the fall of 2001, his easy access to people in the barracks proved fatal. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. "23 years ago, in the fall of 2001, 19-year-old Army Private Amanda Gonzalez braved international phone charges to call her mom. Gonzalez excitedly shared that she was pregnant and she'd already been thinking of names. Her baby, Gonzalez shared, was due on her mother and stepfather's anniversary. I'm almost certainly not going to get the name of this base correct, so I apologize in advance for my terrible German. Gonzalez served as a cook while she was stationed at Fliegerhohe Kaserne, an American Army base in Hanau, Germany. It was Gonzalez's first duty station, and her mom was looking forward to welcoming Gonzalez home over the holidays, so she booked her a ticket so the two could reunite and celebrate this new life. Gonzalez balanced 2 competing interests. She wanted to become a physical therapist for children, but she also wanted to see the world. When she got the opportunity to join the Army and serve in Europe, she saw an opportunity to eventually do both things that she so wanted. She made the most of her first 8 months overseas, and spent her free time exploring locally and taking a road trip to Paris, a 6-hour drive away. But her time in Germany wasn't without bumps. Gonzalez explained to her cousins that there were other women on the base that she felt bullied by. She said those women wanted to fight her, and she'd earned the nickname Firecracker because she was always ready to pop off. At around 4 months pregnant, Gonzalez was beginning to tell those around her that she was expecting, and that included the 2 men she was dating. On Friday, November 2nd, one of the soldiers down the hall from Gonzalez threw a party, which 21-year-old light wheel vehicle mechanic Shannon Wilkerson attended. Wilkerson and Gonzalez had been dating, though it's not clear how serious the two were. Wilkerson's wife, also a soldier, lived next door to Gonzalez. Wilkerson's wife was also pregnant. It's unclear why Wilkerson and his wife didn't live together in the married dorms, especially with a child on the way. Moving an entire house for a PCS or a permanent change of station is difficult, but moving your duffel bags from one fully furnished barracks room into a jointly shared fully furnished barracks room is not the same undertaking. At the party, Wilkerson continued to be himself. He was a social butterfly, coming and going from the party. When he returned sometime around midnight, he tried to rally his troops and motivate people to do shots with him. But people turned him down, so he returned to his own barracks building to hang out with another friend before going to a bar on base. They stayed at the bar until it closed at 2 a.m. on Saturday, November 3rd. But he wasn't ready to call it a night, so he suggested that they go to a still open off-base bar. His buddy didn't want to go, but he helped Wilkerson to go to an ATM to pull out some money to go out with. Wilkerson had only shorts and a t-shirt on in November in Germany, so his friend loaned him the sweatshirt off his back to make the walk to the front gate and out to the bar. But gate guards turned Wilkerson back, deciding he was too drunk to be let loose into town. There was approximately an hour between when he got turned back at the gate and the next report of Wilkerson visiting friends. Undeterred, Wilkerson went to another friend's room to continue drinking sometime after 3 a.m. He told one of his friends there that if his wife asked, he'd spent the entire night drinking with them. Wilkerson took off that gray loaned sweatshirt and left it behind, and at about 4 a.m. he wandered into yet another friend's barracks room and asked if he could stay with his friend and his friend's girlfriend to watch TV. Maybe I'm too old to understand this behavior anymore, but at 4 a.m., when everyone is either completely wasted drunk or sleeping, Wilkerson was a few buildings away from his own room, and he could have, and arguably should have, just gone home. It's so foreign to me to go drunk trick-or-treating for friends to hang out with during the witching hour. But I've believed that nothing good happens after 1 a.m., so it's entirely possible I'm just a curmudgeon. While in his friend's room in the wee hours of the morning, he repeatedly told them that he effed up, while he hung his head in his hands. Gonzalez's friends knocked on her door over the weekend, hoping to rouse her to adventure with them as she normally would, but she didn't respond. They recalled last seeing her at about 10 p.m. on Friday night. The following Monday, November 5th, Gonzalez, who was by that point 4 months pregnant, failed to show up for work. The Army wasted no time in trying to track her down, and when she didn't respond from inside her locked barracks room, they broke down the door. Inside, they found Gonzalez, dead. She'd been brutally beaten and left mostly naked. An autopsy later revealed that she was killed by asphyxiation, specifically strangulation, though it didn't rule out concurrent suffocation. Her keys were missing and were never recovered, which might explain how her door was locked. There was no video surveillance of the barracks. There was no way to see who'd come and gone that weekend. In the days that followed Gonzalez's death, Wilkerson's friend retrieved the borrowed gray sweatshirt from another barracks room. CID collected that sweatshirt, which I think means they had some narrow suspicions pretty early on. Back home in Texas, Gonzalez's mother searched for answers, some explanation for who took her daughter and grandchild from her, and why. She wrote to members of Congress, Dr. Phil, and America's Most Wanted to try to keep the investigation moving forward. The Army Criminal Investigative Division conducted hundreds of interviews trying to piece together who last saw Gonzalez alive and who would have motive to murder her. In 2003, 2 years after Gonzalez's death, Army CID offered a $20,000 reward for information about her death. By 2011, that reward increased to $125,000, but the case still went cold. It would seem reasonable to talk to the father of Gonzalez's child in order to determine whether he had reason to kill her. Doodled in a notebook in her barracks room were potential baby names, mixed with 2 potential last names. In the years that followed her death, the investigation did have some promising developments. One of her other neighbors in the barracks, Chin-Yu Kim, was arrested for the June 2006 double murder of a father and son in Clarksville, Tennessee. It's unclear if Kim was still in the Army and stationed in Clarksville when he murdered those two men. In 2010, he pleaded guilty to the murders, I think in order to get the death penalty off the table. He received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. But while all that was going on, and in spite of the forever sentence he received, Kim didn't make any confessions about Gonzalez and his time in Germany. Although there is a paucity of details for what led Kim to kill the two men, we can perhaps make some inferences from his original charges. He was arrested quickly after the deaths and was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of felony murder, 1 count of especially aggravated kidnapping, 1 count of aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of theft of property valued at over $1,000. His weapon of choice, from what I gather, was a gun. It would seem to me that Kim was motivated by financial concerns and that he chose a weapon that allowed him distance from his victims. Which is all to say this wasn't very similar to the very personal method of killing Gonzalez, assault followed by strangulation and suffocation. But there was something else that weighed against Kim's involvement, namely his actual weight. He was too small in stature to have been Gonzalez's killer. Thankfully, the evidence collected in the wake of Gonzalez's death was stored properly and kept. Things that don't always happen when evidence storage areas are tight quarters. DNA technology in 2001 was still an emerging science. The first DNA test conducted on that gray sweatshirt was inconclusive. It wasn't until 2021 that the technology advanced enough to get what investigators needed to dig back into a 2-decade-old cold case. They ran that sweatshirt for DNA again. They found 3 matches. 1 was the owner of the sweatshirt, 1 was Wilkerson, and 1 was Gonzalez. Authorities arrested Wilkerson in February 2023 while he was working as a contractor on Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. When Wilkerson visited Gonzalez between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. on November 3rd, he believed she was pregnant with his child. He told others that he had animosity towards her and that his relationship was failing because of her. But records from the autopsy made clear that Wilkerson wasn't the father. He'd had this hard partying reputation when he arrived in Germany, and I think that comes across pretty clearly hearing about how he went from room to room, party to party, drink to drink. Much like Calvin Halfacre from episode 17, Wilkerson focused on going to clubs, drinking excessive amounts of alcohol, getting into fights, and running around on his wife. After beating Gonzalez and strangling her to death, Wilkerson tried a quieter life and focused instead on church. But his history was not without flags. His previous criminal record held convictions for alcohol-related and traffic offenses, but charges for domestic violence and disorderly conduct had been dropped. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Pensacola pursued federal murder charges against him, and he was convicted on May 7, 2024. He hasn't yet been sentenced, but faces a maximum of life in prison. It's possible that it seems a little weird, a federal court in Florida prosecuting Wilkerson. Gonzalez wasn't from Florida, and she wasn't in Florida when Wilkerson murdered her. In episode 5, the Hennis case, we saw the Army pull Hennis back to active duty to prosecute him, something they were only able to do on a technicality. They didn't have a technicality like that to rely on in this case. But it also wouldn't make sense to turn the case over to German authorities, since the victim, the alleged murderer, and all the witnesses were American soldiers, and because the murder took place aboard an army post. That sort of sets this apart from the Becker case I covered in episode 32. In that case, the crime took place off base, and Belgian authorities originally took jurisdiction before transferring the matter to American authorities. The Federal Department of Justice was able to pursue those charges against Wilkerson in the Federal District Court because of the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act. The act gives federal courts in the United States the authority to prosecute crimes committed internationally by former military service members in cases where the former military service member is no longer subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But after the U.S. Attorney's Office got jurisdiction, they still had to argue about whether to hold Wilkerson in jail while he awaited trial. The government needed to prove either by a preponderance of the evidence that Wilkerson posed a risk of non-appearance that he would flee, or prove by clear and convincing evidence that Wilkerson posed a danger to the community. A magistrate judge ordered Wilkerson detained prior to his trial, which Wilkerson appealed. You may have caught that he hasn't yet been sentenced, so this is the only appeal we have so far. The 11th Circuit Court had to determine whether the government actually met the burden, well, either burden. Liberty, a previous court noted, is the norm, and detention prior to trial or without trial is the carefully limited exception. The Bail Reform Act permits release under the least restrictive condition that assures the defendant will appear for trial. But risk of flight isn't the only concern. There's a competing concern that a defendant might cause further harm. In order to determine whether to allow someone out on bail, a court looks first to the nature and circumstances of the charged offense, second, to the weight of the evidence against the defendant, third, to the history and character of the defendant, and fourth, to the nature and seriousness of the danger to a person or the community if the defendant was released. While a court should consider each of the factors, there hasn't been guidance on how those factors weigh against each other. If the nature and seriousness of the danger might outweigh the history and character of a defendant, for instance. The 11th Circuit described the detention decisions among the most difficult that a magistrate judge makes, highlighting that judges don't have a crystal ball that will tell them if they're detaining an innocent person who will be ultimately found not guilty, or if they're releasing someone who might violate the conditions of their release and go on to hurt others while awaiting their trial. First, looking to the nature and circumstance of the charged offense. Crimes of violence naturally weigh in favor of detention, and the brutal beating, suffocation, and strangulation of a fellow soldier who was 19 and pregnant certainly qualifies as a crime of violence. Turning to the history and characteristics of the defendant, the court considered Wilkerson's ties to the community, his purported character, his health, his family, his employment, his financial resources, his past conduct, and any criminal history. They considered whether the property he co-owned with his brother or the proximity to his mother was sufficient to keep him from fleeing. They delved into his job and his extracurricular activities like coaching baseball and basketball. They looked at how involved he was in his church. They pondered whether he would willingly lose relationships with his ex-wife and their shared 14 and 21-year-old children, even though they lived in North Carolina, and he very much did not. They considered whether he would abscond before meeting the grandchild on the way. The court dropped a quiet footnote to explain that he also had a 3-year-old child, but that he had no relationship with them. So they didn't really need to consider that particular tie. Ultimately, they concluded that his ties to the community weighed in favor of release. And while I do think that release was the correct outcome, and not just because he didn't flee and did in fact stand trial, I feel a little like this was trying to bend the facts toward a desired outcome. I don't know how honest it is in one breath to say, oh my gosh, he's going to be a grandfather, of course he won't flee, and in the next disclose that he has a whole 3-year-old child who he has absolutely no connection with. Cheating on his wife, potentially impregnating 2 women at the same time, abandoning this 3-year-old, I don't know that his relationships mean as much to him as we are pretending. The final factor they considered was the weight of the evidence against Wilkerson. The court considered whether the evidence received during the 4-hour hearing was overwhelming, credible, helpful, and important to the government's case in chief. They had to consider whether the weight of that evidence was strong enough to make the possible imposition of a life sentence a real motivation for Wilkerson to flee prosecution. The evidence the government presented at that hearing painted a portrait of a man deeply upset that Gonzalez was pregnant and experiencing problems at home because of his own infidelities. Given that Wilkerson was later convicted, we know that the evidence that the government had was persuasive in the end, but the court concluded that Wilkerson's infidelity and animus towards Gonzalez had been these known factors for 2 decades. They also reasoned that the DNA testimony that was offered during that hearing wasn't sufficiently detailed to warrant fear that Wilkerson would run. The agent that described the DNA results didn't testify whether it was blood DNA, epithelial cells, or hair that had been discovered on the sweatshirt. The testimony didn't address how they ruled out other DNA transfers from Gonzalez, and, the court mused, perhaps there had been a DNA transfer at the on-base bar while Wilkerson and his buddy were there until 2 a.m. The government hadn't proved that Gonzalez, 4 months pregnant, wasn't at the bar from 1 to 2 o'clock in the morning. I saved this particular factor for last because even though I wasn't 100% sold on his ties to the community claim, this really seems like a stretch. These are such attenuated explanations for how a murdered woman's DNA ended up on a sweatshirt. But applying the court's own logic, there probably should have been a lot more than 3 DNA samples on it. And listen, the vast majority of judges, federal and otherwise, are not scientists. But this portion of the opinion read like something that I would expect to see 15 years ago, but almost certainly not today. I think we, the public, have a better understanding of how DNA and transfer DNA works. But we can extend lots of grace and presume that they don't have time to watch Investigation Discovery. As I mentioned, I do think it was the right outcome, releasing Wilkerson while he waited for trial. Absent the footnote about the 3-year-old, I probably would have said something along the lines of it being unlikely that he was still out there knocking people up that he might then try to knock off. Wilkerson wasn't married anymore. Whether he was sleeping with 1 woman or 5, he was no longer balancing that legal relationship, and he wasn't subject to the anti-adultery laws of the UCMJ anymore. The 11th Circuit ordered Wilkerson released from custody so he could spend the time before his trial under house arrest. Before he'd been allowed home, the U.S. Probation Office had to remove the firearm he disclosed owning. During his house arrest, he had to wear a GPS monitor, abstain from all alcohol consumption, and submit to random drug testing. We should know more about his sentence in the coming month, and when we do, I'll be sure to update you. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we look into a blast from the past. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.